Land Transport Plan. There was also a distribution from an advocacy group yesterday, all aboard. I'm letting you know of all the information that you might like to consider in making your decisions here today. And I think that covers it all. We'll just check. We've covered all the information.
And the responses from Auckland Transport.
Yes, sorry. And an email distributed yesterday, and I think we should probably, that should be tabled. And that is the responses to your many questions over the last month or so that Auckland Transport have come back to us on. I think there were some 20 questions, and that was emailed through yesterday. So we'll make sure that that is tabled, because that's formal information to contribute to our consideration and decision making today on the Regional Land Transport Plan. So now we will go to, just before I go to Jenny Chetwin, the Executive GM Planning and Investment at Auckland Transport, members online, we also have the Chair of the Auckland Transport Board, and that's of course Adrian Young-Cooper. We also have the Deputy Chair online, Wayne Donnelly. In the room, we also have the Chief Executive of Auckland Transport, Shane Ellison, and I welcome the Chair, Deputy Chair and the Chief Executive. And now I'll hand over to Jenny Chetwin. And Jenny, I'll ask you to introduce your colleagues, and you have a presentation for us which we'll go through, and then we will take questions at the conclusion of that presentation. Fabulous. Jenny, I think you were going to introduce or give the Chair an opportunity to open with some words as well.
I will do, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jenny.
So tēnā koutou katoa, it's our absolute pleasure to be here today and to see you. I'll just introduce the team that I have. Can you hear me? Pull it closer. Thank you. So in addition to our Chair, Deputy Chair and our Chief Executive, we have got the team who've been working really hard on this. I've got Hamish Bunn, Mark Fleming and Greg Nelson, and some of our support crew behind as well who can't hide. This is the end of quite a long process. So it started with ATAP and it's morphed through the development of the Regional Land Transport Program. And you'll recall a couple of months ago we came to you and asked for your endorsement of the Draft Regional Land Transport Program that you did, and we've been consulting and looking at the feedback on that ever since. So what we're here today to do is to talk about the final Regional Land Transport Program that our Transport Committee has thoroughly considered and is ready to endorse to you today as a Regional Land Transport Program for the next 10 years, which covers a lot of investment, but also it covers a lot of policy initiatives that we're going to need to really get the transport system that we need for Auckland. What we're going to do today is Adrian and Wayne are going to make some initial comments for you, and then we will give you a presentation which will cover some of the key points about the process, just brief recap, the benefits, the things that are really going to be gained and achieved from this program, a little bit on the outcome of the consultation we've done and the themes that came up and the changes we've made and the Transport Committee has endorsed. And then open up for questions for you to have a think about. We are looking for your endorsement of this RLTP today, as recommended from our Transport Committee. So, Adrian, would you like to make some comments?
Kia ora tātou. So look, the transport, I'm Adrian Young-Cooper. I'm not sure if I'm on screen. I hope you can hear me. The Regional Transport Committee has made the decision to recommend the Regional Land Transport Program to you, to the Planning Committee for endorsement and to the Auckland Transport Board for approval, in full knowledge of the Regional Transport Committee's statutory obligations. We've made our decision knowing that we, the Regional Transport Committee, must give effect to, must consider, be consistent with and may take into account various pieces of legislation, particularly the Land Transport Management Act. And we've also noted that our scope for including or excluding activities from the RLTP is limited to those that seek funding from the National Land Transport Fund, which is administered by Wahikotahi. Fully Crown funded programs such as the New Zealand Upgrade Program fall outside of the scope. We needed to be satisfied that the RLTP contributes to the purpose of the Land Transport Management Act, which is contributing to an effective, efficient and safe land transport system in the public interest. It's consistent with the government policy statement on land transport and gives effect to the objectives and priorities of the Council's long-term plan, which amongst other things requires us to take into account Te Tarukia Tāwhiri Auckland's climate plan and implement the actions specified in that plan. We noted that contributing to the purpose of the LTMA and being consistent with the government policy statement is broad and focuses on several areas, including climate change. We carefully considered the challenge of finding the right balance of contributing to councils and central government's objectives and the feedback that we received through the public consultation process, and particularly that despite the reduction in vehicle emissions, the Regional Land Transport Plan does not do enough to address climate change, and from road user groups that the Regional Land Transport Plan does not do enough to address productivity. With this in mind, the RTC is confident that the RLTP does set the direction for investing in more sustainable modes of travel and provides the appropriate mix of activities, policies and priorities to achieve a range of objectives required of it, taking into account the funding that is available, what is in scope of the RLTP, what is already committed, and planned government interventions. In reaching our decision, we did draw confidence from the assessment of how the RLTP meets the requirements of Section 14 of the Land Transport Management Act, and that is the provisions that set out what a RLTP must actually contain. We're therefore satisfied that the RLTP being recommended to you for endorsement complies with the legal requirements. Whilst we have made our decision to recommend the RLTP to you, we are acutely aware of the challenges that climate change poses for Auckland and the planet as a whole. We recognise that there are a number of initiatives that are underway to move faster in addressing the effects of climate change alongside supporting other priority areas such as urban development and housing. We look forward to working with the Council to identify possible strategies for further addressing transport emissions through the upcoming work on the transport emissions pathway. And if I could, at this point, pass over to my Deputy Chair, Wayne Donnelly, who in particular wants to talk about the near road ahead and how much is changing on us. Wayne.
Wayne, you might be on mute. Can you just check your device?
Can you hear me now?
We have your voice now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for handing over, Adrian. Yeah, we are caught in a little bit of a odd timing with this RLTP in a way, and I just want to put to the committee that we will be meeting about this time next year, I think, and will be a number of things we'll be taking into account in terms of looking at this particular RLTP. One of those things will be the government response to the Climate Commission advice, which we don't know for sure yet. The other will be the progress that we have jointly made on the transport emissions reduction plan that's part of your recommendations today. We will know the outcome of the current Auckland Light Rail process. We'll have a view on, we'll know what the outcome of the select committee work on the congestion question is. And we will know what the 2022 government budget will be and what that might offer Auckland in terms of funding Auckland Light Rail accelerating Eastern Busway, accelerating Airport to Botany RTN, building on Puanui, accelerating RTN to the northwest, and providing operating funding for growth for PT and encouraging the uptake of PT. There is a lot in play over the next 6 to 12 months, in which we can sort of assess again this RLTP. And I'd just like to support what Adrian has said. I think the Regional Transport Committee has, with the help of all the staff involved, I think put to you an RLTP that is good for Auckland in the circumstance we currently find ourselves in.
Kia ora, Wayne. I'll hand back now to Jenny.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks, Wayne. Okay, we have a presentation that we will canter through. I'll hand to Hamish to do that.
Thank you, Jenny. So I think, as you're all well aware, we're here to seek the Planning Committee's endorsement of the final RLTP for 2021 to 2031 before it goes to the AT Board for final approval. In terms of the outline, we'll just run you through the background to the process by which we got here, some of the results from RLTP engagement, recap what the RLTP delivers, and then go into some of the changes from the draft to the final RLTP, including our response to consultation, changes to the funding levels, and some updates. And then we'll just recap some of the work planned as part of the emissions pathway and ATAP next steps. So in terms of the process, I think, as everybody said multiple times, this has been a long path to get here. We started, I think, with my team at least 18 months ago in terms of developing beginning the ATAP process and then into developing the RLTP. And then it has been through extensive governance in terms of ATAP, the ATAP program that really underpins the RLTP has been considered by this Planning Committee, it's been considered by Cabinet, and it's been considered by the Auckland Transport Board and Regional Transport Committee. In terms of more recent engagement, you're all well aware that after the draft RLTP was endorsed by the Planning Committee and Regional Transport Committee, we went out to public consultation using the special consultative procedure, and that was complete on the 2nd of May. And now we, after the workshops, we're in the process of seeking that final consideration and approval from the Planning Committee before we seek, final endorsement from the Planning Committee before we seek approval on the 28th of June. As Adrian has advised, the Regional Transport Committee, who does have the formal statutory responsibility here, has endorsed, prepared and then endorsed the Regional Land Transport Plan. And the next step then is to seek endorsement from yourselves and formally the Auckland Transport Board. In terms of the Planning Committee endorsement, again, just to recap that the Planning Committee's got a non-statutory role, and that arose out of the recommendations of the CCO review, that the RLTP should be prepared jointly and then endorsed by Council before going to the Board for final approval. So in terms of the engagement, as you're well aware, we went through the full special consultative procedure, and that included a whole range of engagement, and we specifically looked to try and get more and more engagement from the kind of groups that we typically don't hear from. So we put a fair bit of effort into that, and went around all the 21 local boards to explain the RLTP and the specific projects that they were likely to see within our area. We engaged with our hui partners throughout this process. And so it was a deep and comprehensive engagement in terms of the draft RLTP. In terms of the kind of feedback that we got around about 5,800 submissions, 21 from local boards, 3 from mana whenua, and an extensive survey that was organised by Councillor Sayers. The feedback we provided, I think, is extensively covered in the paper itself and was summarised at the most recent workshop, so I won't go into the detail of the public feedback. But in terms of trying to summarise the great wealth of material that we received, I think we saw very strong public support for 3 particular key areas: better transport choices, managing assets and growth. Those were the sort of top 3 priorities that people saw for investment. There was a desire across the board to see more investment in transport, especially, as we said, in public transport, walking and cycling, and addressing climate change. As Adrian and Wayne have outlined, this was a kind of a unique RLTP in that we highlighted a number of policy changes that we saw as necessary to achieve the kind of outcomes that the council and our public are really looking for in terms of the transport system. And there was general support from those policy changes, and those were kind of some of the sorts of things around enhanced safety, congestion charging, further steps on climate change. So we saw policy for that. And broadly, in terms of the respondents, there were more respondents that thought roads were not important compared to those who thought they were. So I think we're seeing quite a shift, at least in the nature of feedback that we're receiving. Although a key factor here is that we received a whole host of some submissions from Generation Zero, which were were quite influential on these numbers. So it was very valuable feedback that helped shape the outcomes. There were 2 main areas of criticism of the draft RLTP, and that's what we've kind of outlined, that it doesn't do enough to address climate change. And from the other side, from key road user groups, particularly some of the freight groups, there was a real concern that it wasn't doing enough to address congestion and roading productivity over time. They're very concerned about the potential increases in congestion that they're seeing. If I can summarise the extensive 90 pages of feedback that we received from local boards, and which was presented to yourselves earlier this month, we saw local boards as broadly supportive, but wanted to see more investment, in particular around climate change again. Walking, local projects and asset management were some of the really key themes that came through. In terms of mana whenua, there were 3 iwi and hapu that provided feedback, and their feedback was around protecting the environment, enhanced provision of transport outcomes, a real desire to see equity, particularly in terms of potential EV incentives, and then kind of things around enforcement of clearways and transit lanes, and concerns over congestion, with comments for and against the congestion charging proposals. But a real concern there, I think, particularly around public transport costs and overall equity implications. In terms of the responses, before we get into that, I think it's just worth recapping what is in this RLTP. Excuse me. And this is an RLTP that really continues from the 2018 RLTP, which I think, with the addition of the regional fuel tax as a key and extremely important new funding source, signalled a real change in the direction. Sorry, no, there we go. Of planning in Auckland. So what we're seeing through this RLTP is a step change in investment in rapid transit. Projects such as the City Rail link, Eastern Busway, Airport to Botany, the initial works there, initial works on the Northwestern. The RLTP contains the seed funding investment for city centre to Mangere, and we're hoping that that'll be further built on with government endorsement there. So a real expansion in the capacity and catchment of our rapid transit network that'll be key to getting more Aucklanders on board sustainable modes. There's up to 200 kilometres of safe cycling facilities being delivered through this RLTP with a very substantial investment in cycling infrastructure, increased investment in renewals to ensure that the local network is maintained to an appropriate standard, and continued support for major reductions in deaths and serious injuries, and significant investment to support spatial priority areas, particularly brownfields. So that's a summary. In terms of the RLTP allocations of the money that's going towards new improved projects, it's extensively focused on public transport and active modes. That's making up 57% of the total investment in new improved projects. And then we've still got an extensive investment in the likes of safety, local board priorities, and optimisation in other spaces. There's a remaining allocation towards strategic and local roads. Some of those local road projects are in fact multimodal projects that will improve busways and walking and cycling. Other elements are remainders of projects that were initiated under the previous RLTP, so it's kind of completion of those. And this again reflects a major shift in investment over time. Now, I'm sorry that this slide isn't particularly well labelled, but you can see really the green there is the public transport and walking and cycling. And compared to where we were with the 2009 to 12 RLTP, there's been a real shift in the nature of investment with that sort of over 50% up towards 60% going towards sustainable modes, whereas the dark grey that you see in kind of state highway and motorway improvements is reducing. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to update this graph to reflect the changes to the New Zealand Up program, but that would actually tighten that down even further. So over the last kind of decade or so, we've seen a real shift in the way that transport money is invested in the direction of investment in Auckland. In terms of the share of investment, I think that through the ATEP process, you don't want to say that you've done well in a negotiation, but I think this is generous to the Auckland Council Group in that there's roughly $10 billion of investment, or roughly a third of total investments coming from the Council Group. But nevertheless, around about 2/3 will be expended by the Council Group. So again, that's recognising a real shift in investment towards the kind of local projects that are delivered by Auckland Transport. So coming to consideration of some of the feedback that we received and the changes here, as we said, that there's very strong consultation support for public transport in general. All of the modes there were supported: bus, rail, ferry, rapid transit. And that's an area where we would have liked to invest more, of course. And the RLTP, as I said, already includes significant investment in that space. So in addition to those rapid transit projects I outlined earlier, with the investment in CRL Day 1, of course, we've got connected communities, and some quite extensive projects to continue to improve the bus network within the city centre. So we have fortunately been able to secure an additional $200 million in funding towards improved services. So that's one change that we've been able to make in response to that feedback. But overall, the draft RLTP includes significant investment in the public transport side. Asset management, that was actually generally very well received. I think Aucklanders have wisely kind of learned the lessons perhaps of Wellington and perhaps some of what they may have seen out of the challenge that we had over the Christmas period with Kiwi Rail, and so reflected the need for continued asset management. And again, big support for safety as well, which is, both of these are an area of extensive investment within the RLTP. Walking and cycling. Walking in particular received strong support across the board in terms of an area for further investment. And as we'll come to later, we have been able to reflect some of that with a small change and a small increase in the walking program. Strong support for cycling too. And as I said earlier, this is an area where we're really focusing. And with the changes to NZ Up, there's around about $1.5 billion being invested in active modes, most of which is going towards cycling. So that's kind of reflected in the RLTP. Growth, again, feedback there too was strongly supportive of growth, primarily around the kind of brownfields, sustainable mode infrastructure for brownfields areas rather than greenfields. And that's an area where the RLTP does reflect that, in that there's $400 to $500 million worth of investment to support the Auckland housing program areas. But we've also got some of those greenfield, new emerging greenfields areas such as Drury covered. And those kinds of investments, it's worth noting, while they may appear as local road projects, are absolutely targeted towards sustainable modes. For example, the Drury, a large portion of that is in accessing the railway stations, the 3 railway stations that will be part of the New Zealand Up program. Roads, this is an area, as I said earlier, of limited support and in fact some quite strong opposition. And there was opposition to Mill Road and Penlink in particular, which reflected, I think, in large part the Gen Zero kind of submission. So you've got a strong flavour of that. As you'll now be aware, Mill Road's now significantly de-scoped, and I think with restructuring of investment around supporting more of the kind of sustainable modes within the local kind of network area in the Drury. But outside of the New Zealand Up program, there's actually very little in the way of new roading capacity inside this program. Climate change, as I said, strong support for addressing climate change. And as I mentioned, within the existing RLTP, reflecting that the strong emphasis on, particularly on the PT network, there's a majority of that RLTP investment is directly supporting projects that will reduce greenhouse gases through mode shift. As I mentioned, few roading projects. We will explore areas like tactical urbanism and neighbourhood traffic calming as part of some of our programs, such as the minor projects and the walking program business case. And overall, the plan is expected to achieve a net reduction in emissions when combined with the government's announced initiatives in terms of the clean car standard and biofuels changes there. So we end up with a very small net reduction, and that's despite a 22% increase in Auckland's population over the time period that we're talking about, 2016 to 2031. And I should actually emphasise that that's an enormous challenge in terms of this program. So the kind of investment and outcomes that we're dealing with are in the face of very, very significant growth in Auckland. Nevertheless, as Adrian has said, we see that more needs to be done in terms of climate change. We absolutely recognise that. The RLTP puts a very strong emphasis on the need for further policy changes to get us bigger reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and also that we want to chase further reductions in vehicle kilometres travelled from the private vehicle fleet, fossil fuel fleet in particular. So it needs to be a key emphasis going forward. In terms of the changes to the draft RLTP, just worth recapping that the Regional Transport Committee, who's the overall governing body here, doesn't have the ability to change under the legislation projects that are externally funded from the Crown. So we can't alter the New Zealand Up program. That's something that's funded from us through the Crown, and we just have to include it in the RLTP. And we've heard over the course of this work, the kind of journey to put together the RLTP, that there have been constraints. Because this is a program that builds on 2018, much of it is already in train, whether it's absolutely committed or so far down the planning the planning kind of pipeline that we don't want to pull back from. An enormous amount of the program was what we described in the ATAP process as committed or essential. So in practice, there was very little scope to make additional changes. And on top of that, we still, at the end of the process, you'll recall, needed to find some adjustments to include an increase for the Auckland housing program. So our ability to flex the program has been very constrained going forward. And this is just a kind of an example, just a recap of where we had discretion. If you look at those projects, they're absolutely invested overwhelmingly in walking and cycling or bus priority projects. So our discretionary funding was strongly allocated towards the kinds of projects that will achieve the climate change goals, the better transport, the better transport choices, the safety type outcomes. And here we have managed to introduce a couple of new things, such as the allocation to minor cycling and pop-up cycleways, and also to make improvements for people with accessibility needs, accessing the bus network, as well as the large scale increase that you see in terms of support for the Auckland housing program. It's also worth noting, in terms of that program that was described as discretionary in ATAP, much of it is now included in regional fuel tax. So in order to stay true to the regional fuel tax program that was consulted on, we now actually have very little opportunity to flex away from those kinds of projects, which I believe are endorsed by that regional fuel tax consultation. So in terms of the proposed changes to the draft, to the RLTP based on feedback, it's really been a case of being able to try and refine the program to take into account some of the feedback that we received from the public and received from the boards, excuse me. And that's meant accommodating a number of small projects where we had a combination of kind of local board feedback. It had been something that had been previously in an RLTP, or there'd been some sort of commitment or expectation set, and that there was strong public feedback in support of it as well. So the sorts of things that we're proposing to include are a $20 million increase to the footpath program, one of the Dairy Flat Avenue intersection, that's a $12 million allocation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do the full, I think it's a $50 million project, which would be the full project in that space. We've been able to bring forward some elements of the Lake Road business case and meet a 25% share of Hill Street. Plus, there's a number of other things that we want to do, particularly to increase local board participation in the allocation of our minor programs. Again, we were contemplating whether more could be done in terms of the allocation to local boards, but we're constrained in that space. But we thought there'd be real value in finding a way to engage local boards more in some of the governance of those types of programs. So the total cost of all of that is around about 40 million, and we intend to manage that as a portfolio. If there are changes in the portfolio, it's including those projects as we go along, perhaps as other things may be delayed or other things happen. I described the operating funding increase. It's a $200 million increase in public transport services, particularly bus and ferry, and that was achieved with a $5 million per annum increase from council, plus an expected $5 million per annum efficiency target from within Auckland Transport, and then we're expecting around about $10 million of co-funding from NZTA. Now, I know a number of people have asked for more information on where those services will go. That's still being worked through with Waka Kotahi, and we'll advise on that when that's been landed. So apologies that we can't give you more detail on that one at this stage. I think we've talked about some of the elements of the New Zealand Up program. I'm sure you're aware of some of the key parts, but there's been changes there. The main one as I said earlier, is the rescoping of Mill Road. So there was a reduction in cost and scope to focus, I think, more on the northern end of it, and then supporting some of the more local road or local type initiatives in the Drury area. And then, of course, you'll be aware of the change to the Northern Pathway with a new structure included in that program to ensure that there's a walking and cycling connection to the North Shore. So that those changes are reflected in the final RLTP. We have, had to undertake some rephasing of the Auckland transport part of the program. And that's ultimately reflects two things. In the first year, it was a reflection on our part. I think the program was at around about $920 million. And for this financial year just ending, we're at about $720 million. So there was a reflection that we were likely to be, and we didn't have the confidence that we would fully get to from a $720 million program to a $920 million program. So we thought that was necessary to rephase. But mainly, we've needed to make an adjustment to align with available funding from the long-term plan. So in terms of the graph, that was the funding assumption that was in the draft RLTP, and you can see that we've had to move some of the money, some of the investment out of the first 2 years in particular, and out of years 4 and 5, and then shift it to the years 6 and 7 in the program. And that's primarily to align with the long-term plan. Now, we were advised of some of those funding constraints going into it, but hoped that we would be able to negotiate a solution there. The real constraint here, and I think you can see it in this graph here, is that we are trying to complete two major projects or major rapid transit projects, particularly the support for the City Rail link and then Eastern Busway. So they put a lot of pressure on the program, particularly around those years 4 and 5. So adjusting to that has been a real challenge. And what that has meant in terms of this final program is that we have had to rephase some projects. And the main ones are, unfortunately, Eastern Busway, which has had to have its funding allocation rephased. So it's now 27 and 28, with money taken out of earlier years. And then connected communities is the primary other one where we've had to rephase in order to accommodate that real pressure in those years 4 and 5. Now, with Eastern Busway, in terms of the implications of that, we're still working our way through, because at this point, the alliance that we've engaged in with Eastern Busway doesn't have a specific time frame. That's still being worked out along with the design aspects. But absolutely the intent here is to get on with phase 2 of the Eastern Busway in the Pakuranga town centre, and then progress as quickly as possible with phases 3 and 4. But the thinking is that this the need to rephase the timing of Eastern Busway will mainly impact on the timing of the later phases 3 and 4. Worth noting that we did very carefully consider whether there were any options to avoid this outcome. And part of the challenge here is around the nature of the regional fuel tax funding, which comes to an end in 2028. Because a large part of our improvements program is funded from regional fuel tax, it was very difficult to move other smaller projects outside that time frame to allow for to keep that funding for Eastern Busway. So we did think very carefully about this, but it's a really challenging program trying to complete that City Rail Link in particular, City Rail Link supporting projects and the Eastern Busway, whilst keeping all of our other large programs such as safety and walking and cycling and renewals on track, and then meet with the requirements of the regional fuel tank. So we have thought carefully about this. It's something we would prefer to avoid, but this is unfortunately where we are. On the upside, we have managed to bring forward some small elements of the ongoing cycling program. And in terms of the share of investment in the first 3 years, just to give you a real sense of where that kind of commitment is, in terms of the improvements program, we're looking at over 2/3 of investment going towards public transport and walking and cycling. So even with those challenges and the need to rephase, overwhelmingly the next 3 years in terms of improvements are going to be around public transport construction. So we'll be seeing some big changes coming down the line. And so just to wrap up, in terms of some of the next steps beyond this RLTP, I think we've talked through the emissions reduction pathway work, and that will be a joint piece of work between council and Auckland Transport, joint offices, and potentially some form of joint governance that we're looking to work towards. And that's really going to be about identifying a pathway to meet those kind of expectations for emissions reductions reflected in Te Tawhiri, sorry, my pronunciation of this is not great, in the Climate Action Plan. And this is going to include the investigation of a whole range of factors, particularly what we could do in terms of future projects in terms of the mix of investment, what additional things may happen to help address climate change, what we can do about the vehicle fleet, land transport, pricing, road space reallocation, and behaviour change, and again with a focus on those reductions in VKT, particularly emitting VKT. So the next step there is to come back to both the Auckland Transport Board and I believe the Environment Committee around about August with a methodology going forward. I do know that there's real keenness to ensure that we've got a very good methodology for tackling this, and then we intend to come back with an update around December 21 once we've got a better sense of the kind of government changes and the government's reaction to the Climate Commission's budget. And in terms of other work, there's quite a bit more planned in the ATAP space, particularly planning for decades 2 and 3. We're looking to do work to better understand and address issues around equity and Māori outcomes, and then address these strategic funding issues. What can we do to put funding in Auckland on a more stable pathway? So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Hamish, and thank you, Jenny. And before that, the Deputy Chair, Wayne Donnelly, and the Chair, Adrian Young-Cooper. Now, just at this point, members, what I will do is I will put up the amended recommendations, and I'll move accordingly, and the Mayor will second. Now, I'll just quickly take you through the changes. So yesterday, the Mayor, myself, and the Deputy Chair of this committee, Councillor Bartley, the Chair and Deputy Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, met with our own staff and Auckland Transport staff, and the Deputy Mayor, Deputy Mayor. We canvassed how we were going to approach this meeting and the latest information that we had to be considering here today. We identified an absence of clearly noting te tāruki a tāwhiri, and noting that there needs to be further work, a lot more work, if we are going to meet the targets for 2030 that important strategic document outlines. And then at our last meeting in March, we identified the need for a transport emissions reduction plan. Further work has been done on that, and we now think by prioritising this work, we can see the first not so much the first cut of it, but at least looking at the methodology, so to speak, and the scope at the Auckland Transport Board and the Environment and Climate Change Committee in August, and then we'll get a progress update by December. Now that's quite a compressed timeline, but it has to be compressed because there's some urgency on this. So they are the changes, and I thank the members that I've just mentioned, but I particularly thank Adrian, if you're still with us, the discussions that you and I had some 6 months ago about the need to do something different and pull quite different levers to affect change. So the chair of the Auckland Transport Board has been also instrumental in suggesting and arriving at this critical work that has to be undertaken, and we are going to have to apply ourselves to it. So they are the motions now moved and seconded. What I'd like to do now, members, there's been some information, well, we've raised some questions about subsidy levels coming through from Waka Kotahi, from government ultimately, and we've got some recent correspondence in from the Minister of Transport to our Mayor. This follows discussions the Mayor has been having on our behalf with the Minister of Transport, the Honourable Michael Wood. I will now invite the Mayor to just outline what we now know from the Minister of Transport.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I'm repeating information that members of the Audit and Risk Committee will already have heard from me directly. We received a letter from Waka Kotahi a couple of weeks ago that suggested initially, because of a shortfall in funding of the National Land Transport Fund, that there would be $179 million cut out of our budget. That was later scaled back to $129 million. But I raised this directly with the Minister of Transport. Waka Kotahi had done the same thing in the previous long-term plan. They'd recommended a cut of a substantially greater sum. And again, in this time, following our joint agreement of the Auckland Transport Alignment project, they were going to cut the agreed amount. I made it pretty clear to the Minister of Transport, who is an Auckland MP and understands our problems, that when you negotiate something bilaterally, it can only be changed bilaterally. And we had relied on the amount of money in the ATAP program. We had built that into our long-term plan. Members around the table had voted for that long-term plan. And suddenly we're faced with a cutback that could well have resulted in a downgrade, well, a qualified comment from the Audit Office. Fortunately, the Minister of Transport has honoured his undertaking. He wrote to me before we had to appear before the Auditor General to confirm that that money would be available in full, because we had mutually agreed that under ATAP, and that is really significant. I think what it emphasises to all of us, the value of ATAP. This is not just the government grant to us. This is a negotiated agreement, and when you negotiate an agreement, you honour the agreement, and the Minister of Transport has acknowledged that he will be honouring that agreement. I thank him for that, and that has helped us out of we would be having a different conversation around this table if that were not to have happened. So a big acknowledgement of the work that we're able to do with the Minister of Transport and his positive response.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thanks for that outline, and yes, acknowledgement to the Minister of Transport, absolutely, for resolving that. Now, at the outset, I'd just like to ask myself just a couple of questions, and I think one of them is going to be directed to our own legal team. Adrian, thank you for testing the question of with your legal team, and I just want to put it to our legal team, Adrian, the same, that the direction being taken now on the RLTP is entirely consistent and legal in terms of complying with the Land Transport Management Act and the GPS. So do we have Meredith here? Can I just call Meredith up? I just want to get that question out of the way, because I think that's a fundamental test that Adrian has referred to her own legal team, but I think, members, we need to hear that from our legal team. Meredith, if I can pose that question to you first.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of those obligations under Land Transport Management Act, which include compliance with the GPS and the purposes of the Land Transport Management Act, those are statutory obligations on Auckland Transport. And I understand, as Adrienne has said in her presentation, that they have obtained advice in relation to those requirements. So those are statutory requirements on Auckland Transport rather than on Auckland Council.
Okay, look, the point of my question is that you have reviewed that legal advice, and I know Auckland Transport has sought and received that advice, and you've seen that advice, and you're confident too. I'm asking from our perspective as the Planning Committee of Auckland Council.
I have not received a copy of that legal advice. What I can say is that those obligations that you're speaking of are obligations on Auckland Transport rather than Auckland Council. So in my view, those obligations do not pose any legal impediment to Auckland Council taking this decision.
Thank you. Look, the other question, and it really only came to light quite late, and it's the very last page of this very long agenda, and I think it's attachment D. There's reference to the Eastern Busway, and I'm sure Councillor Young is about to ask us probably a similar question because he is the next on the list to pose a question. But at this stage, can you outline why we're discovering so late a deferral, quite a significant deferral in a big rapid transit project for the East, and it now concludes quite a bit later? And can you also just clarify, Hamish, at D, it's mentioned stages 2 and 4 are at a later phasing, but I think just in your earlier presentation you said 3 and 4. So if you could take us through those 4 phases and which of the phases are being deferred and how you learned of this need for change at such a late part of the process.
Thank you. Well, I think the story is that rephasing of the program took place once the once the allocation from the long-term plan was finalised. So that has been quite a recent, part of the process in terms of landing absolutely what that finalisation would be and the impacts of that finalisation. I think it's happened within the last couple of weeks.
In terms of finalising?
Yes. So, look, we recognise that this is something that we should have advised earlier. It has been quite a dynamic process coming to the end of this. So, that's the reason it hasn't come up. And earlier, it was that the implications were really around the finalisation of the plan in terms of the available funding from the long-term plan. In terms of the implications for phasing, yes, we've gone back to the project team who have confirmed that even before the RLTP, the specific phasing of phases 2, 3 and 4 hadn't been set in stone. It's still being worked through by the Alliance. So the absolute implications in terms of this change to the allocation of funding years over time, we can't say with certainty, but what we can say is that we'd expect the impact on the first phase to be less, less deferment over that phase 2 component, which is a core priority for us to be getting on with. But because of that shift in the last 2 years, it's likely that the 4th phase around the Botany bus station is likely to have the biggest impact in terms of timing. We will, however, though, I think it's worth saying that, these things are several years out, and the capital program, while we're setting out these phases within the RLTP, it's in constant review. It's kind of a dynamic process. So much of this is going to depend on the discussions that we have with Waka Kotahi. We're still expecting quite a bit of change in that space, and particularly around higher co-funding rates. So we'll be constantly working to see what we can do to tighten up that program for the Eastern Busway and some of those other projects that are affected by the funding. And finally, in that particular case, we would still, with the completion of the earlier phases 2 and 3, still anticipate looking to run as many of the services as we can as possible to get the benefits of those earlier phases, even if the final phase isn't quite complete on the timeline that we originally expected. So we'll continue to work to deliver this key program as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamish. Members, we'll now go to questions. If we can just keep to questions only at this point. I've got 10 members at this point wanting to ask questions, so can we be mindful of being succinct, and maybe if we just try and keep it to a couple of questions each at this point, and we'll go back for a second round for a third question if need be. Councillor Young, it's appropriate that I call upon you with the first question.
Yes, please. Do I need to open my video?
Yes, please. If you're Skyping there and if you'd like to open your video, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Through the chair, I have a few questions. I think the first one you're already asking, why the information comes at the last minute on the last page of the agenda. This report constantly advise the full delivery of the Eastern Busway will be delayed by at least 2 years. This is different to what we consult on. So how long has AT been aware of this possible result? And I think they already explained the last 3 weeks. So my follow question is, I appreciate the tight time frames, but why was not this delay raised with councillors, particularly myself, before this presentation and before it arrived publicly on this agenda? Is this always the way done by Auckland Transport?
Thank you, Councillor. I will now go to Hamish to respond to you, please.
No, certainly not. That's not what we want to do, and we can only apologise for the way that this has come through.
Councillor Young, do you have a second question? We've lost your audio now, Councillor Young. You might have accidentally muted.
Okay, sorry about that.
Do you have a second question, Councillor Young?
Yes, I have 2 more questions. In our client plan, Auckland, sign up to a 64% reduction in transport emissions by 2030 and the net zero by 2050. Time is running out. This regional land transport plan focus our emissions to reduce by only 1% by 2031. So my question is, has AT calculated the emissions impact of the delay completion of the stage 2 to 4 of the Eastern Busway?
Thank you, Councillor. Hamish, have you calculated the emissions impact?
No, unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that. In the time, as we've said, it's a reasonably recent thing that we've had to work through ourselves. So we don't have that figure.
Okay, through Chair, my final one. When finishing this regional land transport plan, did you consider the historical under-investment in transport in East and the South Auckland?
Thank you, Councillor. I'll put that to Hamish.
Yes, absolutely. Addressing underinvestment in South Auckland in particular, slightly less so in the east, has been a focus of planning for a number of years now. And I think particularly in South Auckland, well, both south and east actually, this plan does an enormous amount. Eastern Busway is still going in, albeit on a revised timeline. We're getting the interim components of airport to Botany. There's extensive investment in walking and cycling in the Mangere and Manukau town centres, plus the first phases of airport to Botany, which deliver things on that side. In terms of the south, there's investments from NZ Up in the 3 stations, the components of Mill Road, electrification to Pukekohe. So there's a huge amount of investment going into those areas. Part of that sort of 400 to 500 million will go into the Kāinga Ora housing area in Mangere. So I think the south in particular, well, and both the east with the investment in Eastern Busway, do reasonably well out of this plan.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Young. Just on Councillor Young's second question, can we assume then that the emissions modelling, the trajectory, has not changed? You haven't re-looked at the model?
The figures that we've given in that space have been a comparison between 2 points in 2016 and 2031, and because the Eastern Busway is still complete well in advance of 2031, we wouldn't expect this to affect those figures that we've given.
Thank you. Councillor Newman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wilting, so I'm going to have to go soon. I don't want to record as a personal statement in relation to Mill Road, but a couple of questions, if I may, from Auckland Transporting. Good afternoon, Hamish and colleagues. My first question really relates to what is the degree of confidence that Auckland Transport has in relation to not just the 10-year funding envelope for Waka Kotahi, but the year-on-year funding as a component of that 10-year funding envelope. Funding which isn't committed at year 1, but instead committed at year 6, is not as reliable for me as it might be for you. I want to understand how confident we are that we're going to hit the budget targets every year. And the follow-up question, if we don't hit those targets, what would be those first areas of the plan that we would have to look to recalibrate in terms of scale and timing, beyond what has already been identified?
Thank you, Councillor. Hamish?
Thank you. I don't think we can ever be absolutely confident about funding. I think we've certainly learned that through the emergency budget and COVID and the changes that we've seen over some time. And RLTPs, I suppose, are generally a proposal to the NZTA. So all the other regions would be in this same position, that they're making proposals to the NZTA and they don't give an absolute guarantee. However, as the Mayor has mentioned, because we have ATAP and the assurances that we've had from the Minister, and the fact that the GPS itself mentions $16.3 billion of investment, and it's not, sorry, mentions, it emphasises $16.3 billion of investment in Auckland. I think I've got as confident as you can reasonably be that overall allocation from the NLTF will be delivered. However, the way that ATAP was set up and the way that this RLTP is set up is that we have included risk management, a risk management component within the RLTP. And I think we've said very clearly, and this reflects the ATAP prioritisation, that if the full amount of funding that we're expecting from Waka Kotahi doesn't become available, we've outlined a number of projects in what we called Category 3 that we expect we would need to defer in the event of lower than expected funding. And that reflects the prioritisation that you may recall during the ATAP phases between those projects that were committed and essential, and then those that relied on higher than usual amounts of NZTA funding. And they are mainly the allocations to growth in terms of Drury and the Auckland housing program. So those are the ones that it's clearly set out in the RLTP that we would be looking to defer in that particular case.
So a follow-up then, a lot of those particular growth projects are in outer suburban South Auckland, so they would be the ones that would probably have to line up first for the haircut. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
Well, the Auckland housing program's in 3 areas: Roskilde, East Tamaki. I mean, the bulk of that is Roskilde, East Tamaki, and then Mangere. But of course, yes, there are elements in the Drury area as well that we would be looking at.
As part of in response to your question from Councillor Young before, you're talking about how the South fares out of this. Would it be fair to say that a lot of the infrastructure that is being proposed is to accommodate an increased scale of South Auckland as opposed to improving the transport infrastructure in South Auckland for existing residents? That if we are only increasing to scale to accommodate growth, and growth takes a cut first, if we don't hit our budget lines, that in fact, in real terms, there's a risk that service levels in the South will decrease? I
would say that almost all of this program, apart from the renewals and such, but almost all of the improvements is really trying to maintain service levels in the face of growth. And I think in terms of public transport, there is a lot there that will improve, deliver an absolute improvement in service levels for South Auckland. Examples are City Rail Link and the associated rolling stock and other infrastructure will deliver significantly higher frequencies and travel on the rail network. The electrification to the south, the elements of the walking program that are being delivered, airport to Botany. So there is quite a lot there that is locked in and will significantly enhance, and of course, Eastern Busway, will significantly enhance the kind of experience that people in the south and east have with the public transport system in particular. So I think there's an enormous amount there that will be of benefit.
Ask one final question, Chair, because I'm really impressed with a number of the projects in the south, and thank you for the safety initiatives, the intersection improvements and upgrades, really, really important, and I'm a big advocate for increasing renewals. But with respect to the south, you do have, for example, you've got a level crossing removal in the south, but I don't think you've got one grade separation in the south, to alleviate the problem with level crossings. Is that correct? Is there anything in this budget to ensure that we have grade separation to ensure cross-town flow irrespective of increased train movements because of CRL?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair. So in the south there's funding to address the Takanini and other crossings down there. 2 of them grade separated, 2 of them closed. The other funding in there is 100 million for level crossings, which will be more focused around the Western line. That'll be later in the period, but I do say that we do recognise that 100 million in terms of grade separation is not a full solution, but it's trying to at least start addressing the Western line issues.
Thank you. Now, at this point, Councillor Newman did propose an amendment prior to this meeting. It's somewhat out of scope because it relates to the New Zealand upgrade program, which we don't have jurisdiction over. It's mentioned in the RLTP, of course, along with Kiwi Rail, which is also out of scope. So we could not accept that amendment, but in discussion with Councillor Newman, to allow Councillor Newman to express his concern about a particular part of the RLTP, I have invited Councillor Newman to make a personal statement. Now, Councillor, you also need to leave the meeting shortly too. So I'd like to just hold the questions at this time and pass to Councillor Newman to allow him to make his personal statement on a particular part of the plan, and then we'll come back to questions. Councillor Newman.
Chair and colleagues, you're being very, very patient with me, and I thank you for that. I did seek to move, and noting a resolution noting strong opposition. I asked Councillor Dalton if she'd be keen to partner with me on this. She indicated she would. If this has to be by way of personal statement, my personal statement, and I've sent the wording through to the officers, would be to note strong opposition, or my strong opposition to the government's decision to rescope the Mill Road project, which I believe will significantly compromise the ability to accommodate future residential and business land development in Drury. That's number one. Severely exacerbate congestion both on the state highway and local road networks. That's two. And undermine the local community's confidence in the ability of Auckland Transport, Waka Kotahi and Kiwi Rail to deliver a transport network that enables resilience, mobility and choice in South Auckland for South Auckland residents and commuters. That would be my personal statement, Chair, and if Councillor Dalton wishes to add her name to that, that's fine. Anybody else, actually. And I make that statement, Chair, for the reasons given. I would simply say this, that the matter is addressed as part of the commentary in the report, hence my wanting to raise it as an amendment. You've ruled it as out of scope, therefore I can't proceed with that. That's fine, that's your prerogative. And I would simply point out that the Mill Road project is back to where we were about 4 years ago. About 4 years has passed, and I don't believe that this is a settled argument. So thank you for your consideration of those matters, understanding that I do have to leave shortly.
Thank you, Councillor. So we'll make sure that those words come through to our governance advisor, and I will ensure that it forms part of the minute. We'll now pick up questions again. Members, we've still got about 10 on the list here. So if we can try hard to limit it to 2 at this time. And I'll go to the Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You can put my name alongside that of Angela's and Daniel's on that note, because I'm equally expressing the fury of the residents of the South around the decision, the political decision made around Mill Road. My 2 very short questions are, the first one, Jenny, yesterday was probably going to come, that's around productivity. There's an awful lot of mention here around other things that are equally important, but productivity gets sort of a passing mention. So just to put this in context, 10, 12 years ago, we were on par with Ireland in OECD levels of productivity. Ireland now sits 14th, and we sit near the bottom at 44th. So what is this particular RLTP going to help do to lift our productivity around? And how are we going to get there? And I do appreciate the work coming up over the next 12 months around getting cars and stuff off roads, but what else has been intimated here?
Through you, Chair. It's a good point, and it was raised in the consultation as well, and the feedback that we got. It wasn't all just about climate change. There was a whole other lens about productivity. And I think when we think about productivity in a transport sense, we think about congestion. And we are going to see an increase in congestion over the next 10 years. You get that with the population increase that Hamish alluded to earlier. So there's 2 ways we want to sort of think about addressing the congestion issue. You think about the supply and you think about the demand. So in terms of the supply side, there is a lot of investment in this program on public transport, walking and cycling, and part of the trick is to get people off the roads and onto the public transport, and so that's part of the picture. We can also do a lot around optimisation of the existing networks and making sure what we do for the freight industry, for example, meets their needs and enables them to get around. We were with them just yesterday talking about something that seems very small, but it's huge in terms of their productivity, how they relate to the speed humps that we put on roads to close, to calm them and to slow them down. So a lot of the program work you'll see in the RLTP will go towards optimisation of the network as well, which will go to help with that congestion issue. On the other side, of course, then there's the policy around congestion pricing and all those things we need government to come to the table with. So the RLTP has got the call for congestion pricing in there, and we need more in that policy space. That's kind of how we're addressing it, but we recognise it needs more.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My second question, very quickly, is around the public transport poverty in the west and the south again. And I take the comments about the rail and the 3 new stations and so forth, but the vast majority of people who live in the south work south of Penrose. They work at the airport precincts, and that's going to quadruple in size as a commercial area. They work in Highbrook, they work in East Tamaki, and they will increasingly work in Drury. And the public transport allocation doesn't serve those people at all. So what's in this as a public transport option for the people in the west and for the south when they work in those condensed commercial areas?
In terms of the airport and access to that, I think there's quite a bit, and that we will be improving frequencies of the rail network from the south, and then creating that airport to Botany with the interchange at Puanui that's currently being constructed with improved and electric bus services into the airport area. So I think there's a fair bit in terms of that movement. In terms of the other areas, yes, again, the airport to Botany interim improvements in terms of the Botany direction will make an enhancement in that space. And then wherever we can, we're looking to invest in improvements around the Manukau area, and then with enhanced services as well through the greater investment for bus services in particular with that increase in funding.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Now going to Councillor Casey, please.
3 very small bouquets from me on shifts through this consultation process, and I'd like you to have the chance just to say a wee bit more about the 3 of them. The first is the 100 million for the grade separation, and I just love to hear you say you're doing something in the Western Line, because you weren't at the start of this process, so I'm absolutely delighted. So I'd like to hear more about that. The second one is that you listen to the local boards and the advisory panels with regard to footpaths, and there's 20 million extra going in for that. And one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the 19 million for renewals, and you say in the answers to my questions that you're going to have a go at reprioritising the criteria. Will the local boards be involved in helping you with that? Because I think they should be. And the final thing was, and I can't find it in here, but you've spoken about it twice, again in response to the panels, the issue of accessibility, especially for older people and people with a disability at ferry terminals, buses and trains. Where is it in here? How much is allocated? And tell me more about it. Put it on the front page.
Hamish. Or Mark, is it?
Perhaps I start through you, Chair, on the level crossings. As I mentioned, the Takanini level crossings are at the beginning of the RLTP. The Western Line level crossings, or they're likely to be Western Line, that's nearer the back of the RLTP 10-year period. We need to do a prioritisation of those and go through both in terms of what are the priorities, what are the transport and movement issues that they arise, and what are the relative costs of those. So in terms of a number I can give you, in terms of which ones will be addressed, I'm afraid that's work that we've got to do.
And around the accessibility program, that's $30 million. Now, what that is part of the design of all our new projects, we're looking to incorporate accessible design as kind of part of the baseline when we're putting in new infrastructure. And sorry, what this money, $40 million, Mark is reminding me, is targeted to do is retrofit, particularly our public transport facilities, to make them easier to use for people with accessibility needs. Now, more work's needed to work out how far that's going to go, but certainly it's something we recognise that we need to make progress on. I'm reminded by one of my team that Australia is apparently a long way ahead of us in this space, so we're looking to see what we can do to catch up. And then finally, in terms of the sort of reprioritisation process with local board engagement, I can't speak absolutely to that, but when we have changed policy recently, for example, the changes from around the, hell, I forgot my name, fixing the gravel roads.
Seal extensions.
Seal extension.
Unsealed roads, yeah.
Yes, from seal extensions to unsealed road improvements, we have looked to engage with local boards wherever possible. It's what we're always trying to do, so I expect we'd do it in this particular case.
Kia ora, thank you. Now we'll continue with questions. Questions only, and the next is from Councillor Stewart, please. Councillor Stewart, are you with us? We'll just allow our governance advisors to connect with Councillor Stewart, and I'll go now to Councillor Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou, tēnei ahihahi. I have four, my questions are in four succinct parts. The first one is about the feedback itself, and it's really good to see in the report about recognising that the feedback did support transport choice, PT, active modes, and doing more about climate action. That wasn't where AT was at in the initial assessment of the feedback. So I just want to confirm that this is an all of Auckland Transport acknowledgement of the feedback and the direction that's put us on.
Before we go to the answer on that, can we get all the questions out then, and then we'll have a reply on all the questions.
It is kind of in, so moving on then to what's actually in the draft plan, or the plan to sign off. Just looking at our submission that we've about to sign off, Hikina Te Kohu Para, the emissions pathway. It's a fantastic submission, I must say, but it talks about there that vehicle kilometres travelled, VKT, in fossil fuel powered vehicles is the heart of the transport emissions challenge, and our climate plan, Te Taruki a Tawhiri, puts us on a pathway that we need to be achieving, I think it's at least 12% reduction by 31. The only reference, well, there's reference to that in the plan, but more around how it's very difficult. And the only graph is about the forecast increase, an increase of 22%. So I just wonder, where is that going to be in the report, in the plan, sorry, showing the pathway that we need to be on? And also I'm just, I've seen advice that the Auckland Transport gave to the Regional Transport Committee was kind of saying some of the actions that we need to do to reduce VKT is actually too hard, and that's particularly around reallocating road space, or doesn't work because it increases emissions, whereas the evidence would tell us that that's not actually the case. So I just want to make sure that these things are all going to be aligned, because that the VKT conversation seems to be completely misaligned between our climate plan, what we're saying in our submissions, what's in the plan. And also, yes, so I am being succinct, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be succinct. Why is there no network showing that anymore in the RLTP, and what is the delivery timetable for completing a network? The third one is just around, can you talk to any changes that are happening in Auckland Transport to put us on this pathway, like the significant pathway that we have to reduce emissions, around the organisational structure, cultural change that will actually get us to delivering this plan? And the fourth one, I just want to understand, as a matter of process, and this might be through you, Mr. Chair, for me, everything really hinges on what we've got in E around that we're going to be doing this transport emissions reduction plan. So if that plan comes back with a whole lot of recommendations around reprioritisation, how does the RLTP get updated or refocused through that process? Because we're signing off a very significant 10-year plan, but then we're saying we're going to do all this work that might actually require us to do things very differently. So
Okay,
thank you.
I've got four, I think I've got at least 4 questions there. So it's about 100% more than what I did say, Councillor, and they weren't succinct, but we will be generous. Can we succinctly reply to the questions, please? And possibly, Greg, you might want to come into the transport reduction, emissions reduction plan question.
Yeah. Through you, Chair, I heard 3 topics, I think. So one around, are we comfortable with the feedback and the way we're expressing it at the moment? Yeah, I'll have Hamish answer that one. One around really the whole approach to CO2 emissions. Is VKT coming through strongly as one of the key lever? And also, what are we doing internally around our own culture shift and change around achieving that? And what's the pathway forward? So I'll ask Greg to comment on that bunch of questions. And the third one I heard, which is where are we at with the cycleways? So I'll ask Hamish to talk you through where we're at. I think you're on the steering group for the business case, so just some comments on that I think would be helpful. So should we start with the easy one first, the engagement?
The answer to the first question is yes. In terms of this, the question about the cycle network, it may have been involved in earlier RLTPs, but I think what we've discovered is that, that they're significantly more expensive than anticipated to deliver, but we nevertheless have included a strategic cycle network in an accompanying document to the RLTP, and that's Future Connect. So you can see that strategic network online, and we intend to update that over the next couple of months to include a localised network. So those are those answers.
Greg, you're the lead at Auckland Transport. You're going to be the lead on the transport emissions reduction plan, working with our transport strategy team, which is under Jacques Victor.
Yes.
To my left.
Correct, yeah.
So can you cover off that last question, please? I think it was the last question.
So the question around VKT reduction, I believe was the question.
Yeah.
So probably first to say that VKT reduction is implicit in the RLTP around investment in public transport and active modes, because that has reduced getting people out of private vehicles onto public transport, so it's reducing VKT. We'll look at it much more explicitly in the pathways work and what's referred to up here as the Transport Emissions Reduction Plan, looking at what levers there are beyond just the Regional Land Transport Plan. So that's looking at how can potentially funding be changed, what other sort of actions can be taken. So the RLTP is investment focused, which is one important area, but the work that we'll be looking at will be covering many areas, including government policy. That's an important distinction to make. The second question was about, is there sufficient cultural change at Auckland Transport to take this on? I think it's well demonstrated by our chair and co-chair being involved today, and very clear in terms of what their position is on climate change, and that's working through the organisation. I'd also stress that the cultural change is also necessary with ourselves, with council, with our other ATAP partners as well, because to achieve our emissions reduction targets is well beyond just control of Auckland Transport and Auckland Council. And between myself and Ning and Council, who's working with me on the reduction plan, we're directly involving ATAP partners, and we're helping them in terms of making it clear what needs to happen.
Thank you. Maybe, Mr. Chair, you can sum up at the end about how he's going to influence the RLTP.
Okay, we'll go to next question. Is Councillor Stewart with us now? No, we'll go to Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you. On slide 32, what are the values on the y-axis? Doesn't say. It's the one where you've got main project timing changes and you've got bar graph below the zero, which I want to understand as well. You might have explained it, but I didn't catch it. Does that mean you're not spending that much money in those years if it's under zero? Is that a money thing, or it's just it drives me mad when there's no key on your graph?
Okay, we'll go to the slide. Bring the slide up.
Yes, the ones below the axis will be reductions, and the ones above the axis will be increases. So, sorry, I should have been clearer in explaining.
That's the next one.
That's it. That one.
And are they millions on the y-axis?
Yes, yeah, it will be.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I have to go to a local board meeting, so I was going to see if I could frame something I want to say in a question, because I won't be able to be here because of everybody lining up. It's just about...
I've got 7 members that at this stage want to ask questions. I do want to be inclusive here as much as...
Well, I won't be here for any of the rest of it. So
Are you going very shortly?
I have to go at 3 for the local board meeting, and I cannot see how we'll ever get...
I'll be mindful of the time, and say at 5 to 3, give you the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
If members are amenable to flexing the rules a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now try Councillor Stewart again. You have a question, Councillor Stewart? Are you with us now, please?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Councillor, yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Just like Councillor Young, I'm a little bit disappointed that we're only just finding out about this today. East Auckland, has been neglected for investment for a long time. And I just like the question I want to know, we were told at one of our last briefings that we had with our two local MPs that that the Reeves Road that was all going to be, it was all it was all happening. And so can you just tell me why is it that we haven't been told about this until today?
Thank you, Councillor. I'll put that back to Hamish.
Yes, as I explained earlier, this has been a recent development as we've had to rephase the RLTP to reflect available funding. So we can only apologise for the way that it's come out, and you haven't been advised earlier, but it is a recent development.
Thank you, Hamish.
Well, I can see that it seems that the money's all going to cycleways and walking. That seems to be where the money's been taken out of it. And this is really a project that we've got people in our community that it can take an hour just to get from Pekaringa shops to the Botany Town Centre in peak traffic, and we really need this Reeves flyover, and we need all the connections.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there because it's just questions now, Councillor Stewart, and thanks for making those points.
Hold on, Chair. Could we get that clarified? Because the bar graphs on one side are 2 million and the reductions are 100. That's not cycleways to bus.
No, look, members, we're not going to explain, everything at this stage. This is time for questions. You can do that in your speaking turn if you want to, debate a councillor on a point that they may have made. At this time, I've heard a question, a comment's been made with it. I'm just going to take it at a good, positive face value and move on to the next question, which is from Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just two questions. The first around the Eastern Busway, and following up from Councillor Young's questions on that. It's great that the 1.4 billion is going ahead, but it's not so great that it's being deferred in the latter stages. Can you just first of all confirm that doesn't affect the completion of stage 1, which is Pamua to Pakuranga?
No.
Okay, second question is, this is spread out over a 5 or 6 year period. If there are a favourable change in circumstances, we know that COVID hasn't hit quite as hard as we feared that it might. Is there a prospect of bringing some of that forward again?
That would depend on how the project timing goes, but absolutely that's what we would look to try and do as much as we can. We don't want to see this delayed any more than anyone else.
Yeah, okay. Well, just make the point, I think quite a few of us, because of the importance of the busway, would see that as a priority if we have an improved financial situation to get on with that. My last question is pretty straightforward. Footpaths, glad you're spending more. You said 20 million more, and then I'm looking at your slide and it said the total cost of the proposed increase is 40 million. I'm just trying to reconcile those two figures.
Through you, Chair, there's probably three components to it. Firstly, 20 million worth of footpaths. Secondly, about 12.5 million worth of work at the Dairy Flat Highway Avenue intersection. That's an uninflated figure. And then a local share for Hill Street. So, although Hill Street's already in the program, so collectively we've put those together and said it's about 40 million.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'll now go to the Deputy Chair of the Committee, Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. I just have two questions. How confident are you that we are not misleading the public with statements such as accelerating Eastern Busway when we're pushing it out for 2 years? And then also statements like in here, we talk about enabling and supporting Auckland's growth in brownfields, yet we aren't starting funding for the Auckland housing program until 2024-25, but we're starting a greenfields development funding like as soon as possible.
Well, certainly in terms of the brownfields and some of the greenfields, since there was no funding for those things in the previous RLTP. I think the sort of $400 to $500 million allocation to the Auckland housing program is a significant change from what we were able to do earlier. I think we've been clear that because we're still trying to get through the likes of Eastern Busway and City Rail Link in the early parts of the program, then the best we could do is bring those new kinds of projects, such as the support for the brownfields areas in. They would necessarily have to come later. Nevertheless, I think that our Kāinga Ora and central government are keen to see that completed earlier, so we may be able to work with them to work out some sort of financing or bring forward arrangement.
I think it would be a good idea to bring it forward. I mean, you've got people moving into those areas and yet no change in the roading infrastructure or other infrastructure there to cater for all the people moving in. My other question is around, a lot seems to sit on people making the mode shift. Yeah, a lot, even in terms of economics, and unclogging our freight connections is linked to people getting out of their cars. And so my question is, what are we doing to socialise the change that people are going to experience on the ground so that they can see that they have a part to play in this big picture? Because all this talk about mode shift, VKT, means nothing if we don't have people on board with us.
So we do have other programs and a lot of comms and advertising directed at encouraging mode shift, but with the scale of some of these projects that we're delivering, I think part of the effect is that people will be able to see that you get a faster, better trip with the kinds of projects that we're delivering. So, you know, the rapid transit investment in particular, I think will speak for itself in delivering rapid, frequent, uncongested travel.
I guess that's the problem, though. We've always relied on just hard infrastructure, build it and they will come. But as we see with a lot of our projects, it doesn't work. You've got to do more to get people to change their behaviour.
Okay, so save that for speaking to if need be. And I'll now go to Councillor Watson.
Firstly, thank you for your presentation and your sterling efforts to balance all the various interests around Auckland. I think you've been relatively successful in that, so thank you. But my one question, notwithstanding what you said, Hamish, about the lack of detail surrounding the extra 200 million for OPEX for bus and ferry services, just a general question, and I know the ferries often get lumped in with the bus services, and the funding tends to be a rather disproportionate. It's not quite the 50-50 split. So in light of the quite significant number of submissions during the RLTP on the ferry services from the various parts of Auckland, I'm assuming that the new bus and ferry services is going to be, and I'm talking just about the ferry services here, quite a reasonably significant improvement on what was originally envisaged in terms of provision of new services, i.e. in the original draft, the new was going to be very limited when it came to ferries. So I'm assuming from that large operational increase that we perhaps might be able to go a bit further in the number of new services we put on to encourage, greater use of the ferries from around Auckland. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Thank you, Hamish.
So my understanding is that actually, and as I said, this is all being worked through, but our first priority will be looking to fund what we're expecting to be a higher contract cost that comes with renewing of the fleet. So as contractors need to replace the fleet, they're likely to increase the costs to us. So the allocation there will be going first of all towards ensuring that we do have a renewed existing fleet. And I think there's an allocation here to look at electrifying, elsewhere in the program, to look at electrifying some of that. But that'll be the first place, and then any ability to go towards new services will go there, but I'm not sure how much we can deliver.
So just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. So in light of the fact that, quite understandably, you're working on that detail now, when are we be likely to get, some more specifics there? Because I know certainly in terms of the submissions, that's the sort of detail people are really interested in hearing at this stage.
Yes, I think we'd expect that to be perhaps a month or two as we work through with NZTA what the NLTF funding is. I should say that while the 200 million is of course quite a large increase over that time, the actual year-on-year increase, it's 10 million worth of new services that is then continued forward. It's mainly an increase that's going to occur over the first 3 years. It's not a progressive increase over time because you're essentially getting up to 10 million worth of new services and then continuing it.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Jenny, just on the ferry procurement strategy, that's in its final stages of being worked up, and I think it's due at the AT board. Is it July or August?
Through you, somewhere around there, but I can confirm that for you. Yeah.
But that's an important cog in that whole discussion too, Councillor Watson. And now I'll go to Councillor Fletcher, and then I'll come to Councillor Cooper. Councillor Fletcher, please.
I'm sorry, I've been having a bit of a coughing, but so you'll have to forgive me. My question's related to Mill Road, and I think we've already dealt with it, so I'd like to add my name, if I may, to the statement by Councillor Newman.
Okay, we will do that, and we'll check with you as to the copy that we've received so that the signatories or the names that are attached to that are all comfortable with it, Councillor, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. I will now, with the leave of the meeting, go to Councillor Cooper, and so we're going to a speaking turn to the motions. Councillor Cooper.
Are we clear? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I also want to agree with our councillors from the south, their frustration and disappointment with a Mill Road downgrade. I mean, with 100 years left on quarry licences, how will trucks continue to cart critical aggregate to build the houses that we all want and the local roads and footpaths that service them? So, while that development is inadequate to the task. So that's that. The other one, I do want to say it's good to see the first stage of Lincoln Road is funded, and is, even though it has been deferred over and over, because if there is a future RTN is to be successful, Lincoln Road will be a major feeder road into the interchange and needs to be built to accommodate free-flowing buses, not congested buses to get there. I know Eastern Busway and Northwestern Busway improvements lumped together, but I just want to single out that it's only 80 million for Northwestern and 336 for Eastern Busway, but I commiserate with my Eastern councillor colleagues that is delayed because we're supposed to have a commitment to reducing emissions, but we keep delaying public transport. But also this small amount of investment, though I do appreciate the efforts that went into it, Deputy Mayor, you've done on that and the Mayor, but it means it doesn't align with the impact of congestion on Māori, which is outlined here in the plan, given that most Māori and vulnerable communities live in West as well as South. In the West, access to employment via public transport is less accessible, and these improvements are late to the party and too slow in staging to a full RTN, which could benefit a future 250,000 catchment, which is not an insignificant number for the growing Northwest. Unfortunately, so I don't see long-term funding commitment to completion of this much-needed travel choice. It's been deferred another 2 years. The first indication we had was, we'll have the bus stops up and we'll be digging by Christmas 2019. And now it'll be 2023, 4 years later from that. How many more emissions belched out, financial costs and loss of family time will accrue over that time with cars stuck in congestion? And though I think giving PT discount on community services is a good thing, it doesn't provide the service. So there's no discount when one must use a car because the service isn't adequate or non-existent and employment opportunities are far away. This creates transport poverty with no way out unless we act. And because we really don't have any real decision-making ability about this other to endorse this, we can't really act as a council. We can only put our views through to the Regional Transport Committee. And it does aggrieve me that as governors of Auckland, we don't really get a say other to then endorse. But I will endorse it because I still want us to start something. And thank you. And I do appreciate all the work you've done and I understand the constraints, but I must speak up for my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And thanks, members, for the leave for that speaking to. And we'll go back to the questions. And I've got questions to come from Member Glenn Wilcox and Councillor Hills and Councillor Sayers. I think we'll close it off there, but signal now if you have a question to put. And we'll start again with Member Wilcox, please.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'd just like to ask firstly the question regarding your Maori impact statement. I think in point 75, you were asked on the 11th of March to do some work. I didn't see in your presentation any update on that regarding that work with mana whenua.
Who's best to respond to the question?
And do you want me to go to the second one?
While the Hamish and team are thinking about that one, would you like to go to the second question now, please? Yes.
So when you do this plan, do you make a plan for where we're going to get all the people to do all this infrastructure? The minister came last week or 1 week and said the problem is we just don't have the people to do a lot of this work. And my concern is where in this plan is the provision there for upskilling and training of our bus drivers. If we have 20 cars off the road, we need another bus, we need another driver. Where is all of that in this? Thank you. There's my two.
Hamish.
Thank you. I'll address the second one first. So in terms of the plan, it's not brought out specifically, but one of the things we have had to respond to is a higher cost of public transport, and part of that is the provision of wages and training for bus drivers. So that is incorporated within the overall operating costs that we include here. I think more widely that Auckland Transport is trying to do a lot of work, or not trying, we are succeeding in wherever possible, including Māori businesses and trades schemes and apprenticeships as part of the contracts that we're letting for a lot of bigger projects. So we're also looking to upskill the workforce and create capacity that way as part of what we're going through. Sorry, and on the other issue, Mark?
Yes, through you, Chair. The other issue which I recall came up in the March Planning Committee meeting was around ATAP work and follow-up on ATAP work or continuing work with ATAP, and it related to the issue around equity and Māori outcomes. So that's issues that will still be picked up by ATAP in forthcoming work.
So do we have a timeline for that?
We don't currently, so we need to turn our minds to how to engage with the ATAP stages 2 and 3 processes, and that's something we're thinking about now, so that's to come.
Yeah, we are talking about finishing it off this year, or aren't we?
Really
so what? Yeah, I'm kind of a little bit wary, Chair, about saying we're going to talk to somebody, but we actually haven't even got to the stage of actually sending them an email and saying we want to talk to you.
It's through you, Chair. It's quite a big process to bring the ATAP decades 2 and 3 work together. So there is talk about how we're going to do that, but we have to engage with other parties on that.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go down to Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. And I think you probably set out a sigh when I asked this for the 4,000th time. But there's so much good words in here about climate change and the response to it and what we need to do and what we have to do and the response from the community. We passed Te Tarakia Tāwhiri over a year ago, or about a year ago now, unanimously. Climate change emergency unanimously, halving our emissions unanimously. The political support's there. Climate Change Commission advice says what we have to do. Like, could you just, what am I supposed to say? How am I supposed to support this? What do you guys say? And it's a shame that Shane maybe couldn't be here, because I know it's not everyone has got a place to, everyone can play a part in this, but I'm just confused at how we can support this when it still doesn't reduce our emissions. It's marginal, and why doesn't it? Or what could you have done? What are the options? Like, I just don't know where our options are if this is the roadmap.
So, through you, Chair. So, a couple of comments. Your point about everyone's got a role is really critical, I think, and we can only achieve so much through the Regional Land Transport Program, which is around investment and around policy shift. But there are other players who've got massive levers. We've talked about this before. MOT, Waka Kotahi, other private sector in terms of their levers they can bring to achieving things. And I think the challenge of getting to the targets that you've set in the Climate Action Plan, which are ambitious, and I accept this political direction for that, absolutely. We've got to take some pretty innovative and courageous steps for Auckland in achieving that. So I really do endorse the work we're going to do on the climate plan, the future pathway, to work out what it's going to take to get Auckland to that position. Where we've got to with the RLTP is as far as we can go with the money we've got available and the funding we've got that's freeboard to be able to reprioritise. And we think we've got the best mix in here of what we can achieve through this particular mechanism. But the pathway going forward is the conversation, and it's going to bring a whole lot of other players to the table and have a whole lot of really good thinking across Auckland to achieve where you want to get to.
And just two quick questions. The one on the Eastern Busway, and I guess I'm just not clear of what is going to be open on the normal time and the last bit isn't. I guess explaining that. And the other thing, I guess I just don't feel like I've had an opportunity to help. Like Auckland Unlimited came to us and told us what they were short through the LTP. You guys came to us and told us about the 200 million operating, and we helped address that. But we were never told about this bit. So we've never had the opportunity to go, could we reforecast the debt to revenue? Is it about bringing something? I don't know. Like, we're just stuck now having to approve something that we never got the opportunity. So I guess what's going to be open, because you're still funding about $150 million a year on Eastern Busway. So I guess, because the story is the whole thing's delayed. But do we have that information? And why we weren't asked?
You go.
Through your chair again. So I would point out that there's about 360 million at least over the first 3 years of the RLTP. So it's still a substantial investment. So over 10 to 15% of the program each year is going towards Eastern Busway. So within the first 3 years, still a substantial investment in it. The first priorities are going to be that Pakuranga Reeves Road flyover. So those are the ones that will go for, first. That's EB2, following the extension to Pakuranga, so EB2. Following that, the timing is a little bit less certain, and that's because the Alliance is still doing its work on what the longer term plan is. And so we do think that there is room over time to actually look at this program, readjust it in terms of whatever the funding constraints that we face are. But in terms of your particular question is what goes on first, we do have 360 million in the first 3 years of the plan, and that is towards the Reeves Road. So the first capital of the rank will be the Reeves Road, Pakuranga end of it.
And my last question, sorry, Chair, on renewals, 1,000 times again I've said, how are we refocusing that renewals budget? It's significant. How can we make sure that that is adding transit lanes, adding cycle lanes, adding widened footpaths as we go, even if it means match funding with other budgets? Because I still have, even though we've asked, it's not clear in here And I know we can only fiddle with 1.8 billion, but the renewals budget is something that I'm just still not sure where the policy changes to allow slightly better outcomes through that renewal budget that could lead to climate emissions dropping.
Thank you, Councillor. With renewals, we have to replace on a pretty much a like-for-like basis. Now, we will make small adjustments where we can, but under the rules that we have in terms of waka kotahi and our own approach, we are focused on renewing the asset. Now, what we do need to do and will do is ensure that our renewals are as much as possible coordinated with our improvements projects. So when we're delivering a new project, we want to make sure it's coordinated with renewals so we're getting best value for money and only achieving a dig once. So there's a lot of work going to be going into that. So it's not going to happen every time, but so that the public and yourselves can see more clearly that there'll be coordination between renewals and improvements projects.
Thank you. Councillor Sayers with the final question.
Yeah, I'll keep it concise. So it was very helpful for Mayor to tell us about the subsidy issue. So thank you very much for that. And just picking up on the second question of the Mayor's, which was very helpful as well, thank you. And that's around that, you called it a portfolio of 40 million that you could bring through. I'm not quite sure how that gets activated. That gets activated if some of those projects, there's a list of them, could get FAR funding, or some of them have to have other projects deferred before they come on board. So could you just elaborate a little bit more how that portfolio gets activated, the different projects within it? Just for clarification. It could be a mix.
Yeah, and to explain that, each year Auckland Transport has a budget of 800 million, a billion, and there'll be numerous projects that get spent against that. We know that projects don't always go on time, so perhaps there might be consenting issues or consultation issues, design issues. That does mean that sometimes we underspend, and what we're signalling with the portfolio approach is that we can, if we do have an opportunity where the funding's available, where we know that the co-funding from Waka Kotahi is available and the project's ready to go, to be able to push that project if something else gets deferred. So it's really sort of recognising that over an 800 million billion dollar type of program, there is some flexibility in that.
If I may, just in terms of you coming back and advising councillors of what projects do get activated and which ones don't, does that need to come back to us? Do we get informed, or is that just a board, Auckland Transport Board decision?
Those are decisions for the board. And just to be clear, we're not deferring. The impact on Eastern Busway is not a result of this small refinement of additional projects that we'll be looking to work into the program over time. Just to be clear on that.
Okay, that concludes the questions, members. We're at the end of that stage, and thanks for your many and varied questions. We started this process 7 meetings ago. We've had 7 meetings, firstly with the Finance and Performance Committee, and then we had meetings and workshops of the Planning Committee, and it's culminated here. We're being asked to endorse the Regional Land Transport Plan for 21-31 to go to the Regional Transport Committee. So we're recommending back to them and asking them to endorse this Regional Land Transport Plan. It's, as I think everybody's expressed, it's uncomfortable. It's nowhere near where we want to be landing, but there are significant constraints. One of those being, of course, the financial constraint, which is enormous. So combination of a lot of discussion, a lot of examination, some good interrogation. I do want to say thank you to the Deputy Chair of the Auckland Transport Board, who's still with us. Unfortunately, Adrian has had to drop off the call, and our Chief Executive of Auckland Transport had to leave at 2:30. But Wayne, I think you're still with us, so please convey to your board our appreciation. And having been at your board Wayne, I know that you have asked some very demanding questions of your officials along the way in arriving at this that is before us today. It is a program that doesn't go far enough, but we've got to do more than just the investment program. You are not going to remotely get near that emissions, 50% emissions reduction target by 2030, or even get on the trajectory towards that by thinking that just capital and operational expenditure is going to get you there. And that is one of the key things I've learned out of this. Yes, there's been some reweighting here in favour of rapid transit and active transport and road space reallocation, and we'll see the fruits of that, but it still won't be enough. So we've got to pull some other levers, and we're going to have to be pretty bold in doing that. You know, we talk about this brave new world that we're in. You can only be in a brave new world if you're prepared to embrace the brave new world. And so the challenge is coming up for us. And our city is going to have to change in the way we move around and access places of learning and earning, our friends, etc. And it's going to have to change quite quickly. And it's going to be extremely testy as we make the political decisions to get us to that point. We can't dwell too long. So the RLTP in some ways points us in that direction. It's a bit like, if I could use the analogy from cricket, it's like a long Kane Williamson innings, and he's only just arriving on the field. And there's a double century being lined up. But this is a real long haul, but you've got to make the calls early on. So this plan generates some momentum, but we're going to have to accelerate out of this small momentum that we are confirming through the investment package. We're going to have to take some big strides, and they're going to be difficult. Without doubt, they are going to be difficult. But if we're going to tackle the motion E there, and that is not an exclusive list of things that we need to be addressing, that is just some of the things that we are going to be addressing. On the social equity front, we know already through our discussions on transport pricing, and we'll probably hear back from the Select Committee in the next few months, actually, on where they are landing, following our submission of just last week that the Mayor presented on our behalf. We're going to be looking at road space reallocation, and that will involve, for the first time, Waka Kotahi reallocating road space on the motorway networks of Auckland. They won't be just general traffic lanes anymore. There will be likely high occupancy vehicle lanes. There might be freight lanes. There might be bus lanes, or a mix of that. But Waka Kotahi is going to have to come to the party as well for the very first time and start to see the need, the absolute need to reallocate road space on our motorway network. So the deliverables of that particular part of the motions here today, the recommendations here today, the deliverables out of that E are going to be what sends us off into this brave new world. It is going to be tough, but there's no question about the need to do it. We just have to be on that path. Now, the other thing that has been added here is that there has been a sense of urgency because from our briefing yesterday, we asked for this work to come back to us by August and then by December. And no doubt we'll hear some further, see some further reports early in the new year. But the expectation is that we land this work and show this direction as early as possible, because the investment program committed to here today through the RLTP is not enough. It is not remotely enough. And the last thing I would like to mention is there's been a pretty arduous process dealing with the Auckland Transport Alignment Project and then the RLTP. In my opinion, the ATAP, the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, has somewhat usurped the authority of the Regional Land Transport Plan. ATAP not being statutory and this process being statutory, with the ultimate statutory responsibility at the Regional Transport Committee. I think we actually amongst all of us, Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, and with Waka Kotahi as well, and with government, we probably need to undertake an internal review of what ATAP means to us and how it fits into RLTP. The last ATAP became quite prescriptive and it dropped down into $10 million categories. We've not seen that before. And I don't think it's necessarily helped us. I'm not discounting the value of ATAP. I'm actually questioning whether ATAP should be prescriptive to the point of $10 million projects and programs. And I know the Auckland Transport Board is asking those questions as well. So let's reflect on that process that we've been on for a couple of years now, quite a few years, and landed this here today. Do I commend these recommendations? Yes, but there's some very big caveats. And the caveat really is in the enormous amount of work yet to be done. So members, I hope we can support these. I'll now hand to the Mayor.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Look, I've done quite a few budgets in my time that I've been part of developing, and I've never once done a budget where I've got everything I think we need, or let alone everything I think that we want, and this budget ain't any exception to that. We are, however, in a period of transformation, a transformation created by population pressures and by climate change. The first leading to congestion and the need to do things fundamentally different to deal with congestion, and the second leading to the dramatic need to reduce our carbon emissions. And we move in the right direction, but we don't move far enough in this RLTP. But I want to endorse it. I want to focus on the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. We're putting 31.4 billion into this. That's 3.5 billion more than we did 3 years ago, notwithstanding the impact of COVID. So a significant increase in investment overall. When we tackled the first RLTP, I remember talking to then Minister Simon Bridges and saying, what are we going to do about the $6 billion hole? And there wasn't an answer. The hole was still there, and this doesn't have a hole in it. What we're saying we will do, we are funded to do, and that's basically important. Also, the government's contributing 2/3 of this. I know Councillor Walker has said on a few times, why don't we get the government to do more? Actually, they are in this. And we're putting in the money that we are simply because of one thing. We've got a thing called the regional fuel tax that provides 1.5 billion directly and 4.3 billion indirectly. Without that, we couldn't do any of this. So what do I think the good things about it? The public transport investment, I think those figures we've just seen, where from the first RLTP, we were spending about 15% of our budget on public transport. In this RLTP, it'll be 50%. 15 to 50%. That's pretty dramatic. We'll see PT numbers increase to 150 million trips a year, and we'll see in the morning peak hour public transport and active going to 29% of all transport movements. That's important. Secondly, public safety. Hardly anybody's mentioned that, but the money put into public safety is estimated to reduce our deaths and serious injuries by 2/3. 2/3. That's 1,760 serious injuries and deaths avoided. That's worth commenting on. Third is renewals. It's not just the stuff, Councillor Hills, that you talked about, but if we don't want to see our roads with potholes, dangerous state, causing accidents, totally deteriorating, and our public transport system likewise, then we have to put the money up into renewals, and we've near doubled the amount of money going into renewals. Equity is another good thing in this. Let's not forget Community Connect. That hasn't been mentioned today. That will give a 50% discount to 200,000 people on public transport. A 50% discount to 200,000 people who are eligible for the Community Services card, and that will increase our trips by, I think it's nearly 3 million a year. The fifth point is about housing infrastructure. We've got a housing crisis. We are really putting more money in, particularly into the brownfields developments, which we need because we've got to change our urban form into the transport area there. And the last one is the most problematic and one of the most important, and that is emissions. There has been movement from the beginning of this process to now, where actually, despite a 22% estimated increase in population, we will reduce in absolute terms our carbon emissions. But it's not enough. It's not enough, and we're going to have to do more. And that's why we did the thing on the congestion question. It's why we're wanting light rail to get off the ground. It's why the fee bait makes a lot of sense, so you can actually start getting people thinking about electric rather than carbon-emitting cars. It's about what the chair has said about roading space reallocation. All of those things are going to be important. Is this a silver bullet to everything, this package? No. Is it a big step in the right direction? Yes, and that's why I believe it deserves endorsement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. And Councillor Young, please. Councillor Young, I think you might be on mute.
Okay,
You're with us now. We can hear you.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you. Transportation, thank you, Chair. Transportation is the most important issue Auckland we face now. Eastern Auckland has not received the investment to connect our fast-growing population to the rest of the region. The Eastern Busway starts to changing our story. It's our second biggest transport infrastructure project after the CRL. We should be speeding it up to provide 100% positive confidence for the residents in East Auckland as well as all Aucklanders. And finally, to give a proper transport choice that will help us meet our emissions reduction targets. In the past 2 years, I heard a lot of the feedback that Eastern Busway would not be delivered on time by either 2025 or 2026. I have worked with the community to increasing the confidence to promote the project and get the residents on board while facing disruption, construction, and congestion. The last minute news that there will be an additional 2 years of completion of the most important project for East Aucklanders is a huge blow. I have taken this news back to the community, and at this moment, on the advice I have, there's no proper explanation for me. This procedure is totally unacceptable, and as a ward councillor, I should have been made aware of this issue much earlier to discuss beforehand. I just cannot understand how this huge changing can be made so late, with the ward councillors finding out through an agenda on the last day and on the last pages. The process has not been right. I want more time to understand the changing the options and what can be done to fix it. As the mayor say, I understand there may be options in the future to return the Eastern Busway budget, and I will be definitely following this up. However, as a result of this current uncertainty, I cannot endorse the regional land transport plan, and I will be voting against it. Thank you, Chair. 谢谢.
Thank you, Councillor Young. I will now call upon Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Auckland Transport and Auckland Council, Waka Kotahi, the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor, everyone that's put hours and hours into the RLTP under some pretty tricky circumstances. I am going to support it, but I do just want to say some words about the equity of it. And before I do that, I feel quite moved by Councillor Young, what Councillor Young just said. And Councillor Young, if you need someone to ride shotgun with you, I will come and stand beside you while you speak to your community. I want to speak to the inequity of the RLTP, specifically with regard to a fair transition for people to emission reduction for all Aucklanders, but specifically probably the south, the east, the northwest. Glen Innes, which has been singled out as a location in the Ministry of Transport plan. Just in terms of Mill Road, the Deputy Mayor spoke well to the productivity constraints for those sitting in congestion, hundreds and hundreds of cars, thousands of cars every day, 60,000 cars every day. Councillor Newman spoke quite succinctly to the reasons for our opposition to Mill Road being downgraded in the statement that is now going to be in the minutes. And Councillor Cooper gave a good example of the quarry trucks that are going to be going for 100 years yet. They may be fueled differently. They might not generate as many emissions. They will still need roads, and there's still a lot of truck movements to happen yet. That quarry has another 100 to 200 years life in it yet. I sit in this room sometimes, and I feel like I'm in a different city. When I hear people talking about just about the ease of transition into multimodal, that's how it feels sometimes. When I hear people talk about the south and the connection to the east, which there is none, where I listen to the connection from the east to the airport and how that's going to help the south as well, and I think it has no bearing on what I know from where I live. The bus routes and the timings are not meeting the needs of the workers that are going to the Wiri industrial area, the airport and to Highbrook. Many of our people have complex lives given their commitment to whānau tikanga, their shift workers, their large families, an ageing population, but an active population. There's no doubt that the feedback on the RLTP, as Councillor Coombe identified, has influenced the investment. It's influenced where the plan has ended up. And it should, because we should be listening to what people are saying. But what we need to identify is how we improve connection to the people in the outer suburbs, in the most part, who are not represented, either by themselves or by lobby groups. And so their immediate and short-term needs are not being met. Arguably, they're the highest emitters, and they will continue to be the highest emitters. Auckland Council's Remu team were in the throes of doing a bit of research called Driving by Choice or Necessity, and it would have provided us with a bit of a baseline on understanding the complex needs of why people aren't using public transport, and it was specific to the south. It got canned, it lost funding during COVID, it hasn't been done. But the Ministry of Transport has released a report that they commissioned, and it's called Equity in Auckland's Transport System. And that report found that low income is the most consistent factor affecting people's ability to afford transport to meet their needs. Income and community but when we're making transport decisions, the report said, the income and the community demographics are really used in those transport decisions, which is why we will continue to be challenged on reducing emissions, because we're not doing it with the full data that we need. When you couple that with other factors such as being disabled, LGBTQI, an ethnic minority, female safety, the report found that people miss trips. They just simply do not take the trips and that they could have taken. So the report makes 4 overarching recommendations, and there's 4 overarching recommendations, 15 specific recommendations, but to summarise, the collaboration between the Ministry of Transport and other ministries such as Ministries of Health and Social Development to create a shared policy and accountability for transport equity and its links to well-being must happen. There must be more than just talking to transport. We must talk to all other social departments out there, all other departments that are going to give us information on the health and well-being of people. Making equity an explicit component of transport strategy documents delivered by the Ministry of Transport and other sector partners. Auckland Council has provided this in our recent submission back to the Ministry of Transport. Ministry of Transport led development of policy to improve transport sector engagement with groups suffering from transport poverty and disadvantage. and additional funding and mechanisms to improve transport affordability and choice for low-income people in low-income areas. Just with regard to Te Taruku Atawhiri and its emission reduction lens on equity, we had that conversation about what does the equity lens look like? How are you applying an equity lens? And one of the responses to that was the report that REMU hasn't been able to do through its funding cuts. Equity issues, this is what our climate report says, our climate plan says. Equity issues need to be clearly identified, assessed and made transparent as part of any decision-making process. I don't believe we've done that. It goes on to state, we have applied an equity lens throughout the plan, considering the implications of our actions on all Aucklanders and making sure that we are not leaving anyone behind in our transition to a zero carbon and climate resilient region. I don't believe that we have done that. And if we have, I would really like to see the evidence on it. Intergenerational equity, as well as cultural and socio-economic equity, is critical to a fair transition. And as a society, we are only as safe as our most vulnerable people. So, Chair, my point is that transport decisions are being made without feedback from a large cohort of our community. Arguably, they are the highest emitters of emissions through car-borne use, through necessity. Those who are vulnerable and those who have been evidenced through that report by Auckland Ministry of Transport, Equity and Auckland Transport System. So, Chair, in closing, we've got plans, we've got the Auckland plan, we've got the RLTP, we've got ATAP, we've got Te Taruku Atawhiri, and the words look good and the intention is absolutely true. But we must be prudent to ensure our emissions reduction strategy that we're about to participate in writing doesn't write a cheque that our vulnerable communities can't cash. So I'll leave it there, Chair. I just want to speak on behalf of not just the South, but all vulnerable communities throughout Auckland. We must take all Aucklanders with us, and we must make sure that our transport plans are aligned to meet their needs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And I will now pass to Councillor Sayers.
Some hard acts to follow there, Mr. Chair. It's been a long day, so I'll keep fairly brief. I'm going to endorse this program for the reasons that have already been mentioned by speakers before me. I do want to acknowledge the attendance of people from the public here, been here since 11:30. I think they're mainly here to hear about that $40,000 discretionary envelope and particularly the Hill Street project in there, so very pleased to see that in there. Probably I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the unsealed roading program, which in the last RLTP was 121 million. This time around it's down to 40. So I think those communities are going to see that drop in capital expenditure on that road fairly quickly. And probably what concerns me the most, or equally with the troubles that causes, is the environmental impacts that will continue that. And by that I mean gravel running down into the streamways and ending up in the harbour, mud and silt building up in our waterways, even the dust affecting animal health, people health, and even the photosynthesis of plants that it lands on as well. So all those things do impact. So I guess my comment would be just a signal to the Auckland Transport Board of Directors who are still listening, just to keep the unsealed road improvement program in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. And Councillor Watson, please.
Yeah, thanks. A little earlier on, I think I heard the metaphor, looking at this as a glass half full. The other metaphor I think I'd employ was that Rome wasn't built in a day. And if you drive bus or train or ferry around Auckland, anywhere you go, and I do it when there's the free weekend offering, when you can travel around free. It's quite remarkable to see what's been done in the last decade. Sure, there's projects have blown out and projects have taken a lot longer than they were indicated, but a lot has happened. There's a lot happening now, and there's going to be a lot more happening in the future. So I think just to provide a little balance here, you know, I'd like to thank the AT team that have been working on this. They've got to balance a number of different demands here, from statutory obligations to expectations of quite different parts of the community and various lobby groups. And to be honest, I think they've done a fair job on that. There is more to do. Certainly there's always more to do when your population increases at the extent that Auckland is. I guess the very fact that so much attention today is centering around the climate change goals, or the concerns over how that might not be as ambitious as what one would hope, I think in itself shows that the change in mindset that's occurring, that so much attention has been devoted to that. And just in respect of that, and I think Jenny mentioned it in passing, as much as we've got an important part to play, and the people that keep reminding us of it, full credit to them, because we need to be reminded, that pales a little in comparison to the kind of obligations or leadership of the other party in this, and that of course is the government. And I would direct you to some of the commentary in the agenda item itself in terms of the importance of those other measures, primarily the government's electric vehicle purchases, vehicle fuel efficiency standards, and setting a biofuel requirement. And at the time I thought, well, maybe that's a lot to be putting on just kind of one policy initiative. But I went and had a look at the speech that James Shaw made, and that was just at the time of the release of the Climate Change Commission's final advice, and that was only just a couple of weeks ago. And sure enough, in that there's a very heavy concentration on a future that revolves around seeing cars charged overnight by renewables, people travelling to work in more efficient cars powered by cleaner fuels, incentivising the uptake of low emission vehicles, the Minister of Finance responded pretty quickly to that with 300 million. If you look at Rod Carr, it's very much a similar thing to do with the commentary on how the cost of electric car can be made accessible to those in our community who we know are going to struggle with it, because those operational costs, as anyone who knows who's got a hybrid, is way lower than the conventional fuel. So I guess the question is how do we get people over to those sorts of vehicles in meaningful numbers, so that they can contribute to emission reduction, but B, also be the beneficiary of greatly reduced operating costs, which are currently the domain of the relatively wealthy. The other point that Dr. Carr made that I think has particular relevance to us was his advice that a clearer divide in the modelling is required between town and country, acknowledging that not all communities or commuters in them have the same options for getting around. I don't know if we understand that sufficiently well in here in our commentary, because I think as much as he was referring to rural areas, we could draw a distinction between the outer suburbs. So we have parts of Auckland now who could be doing a lot more. Those are the parts of Auckland that have a lot more access to cycleways, to bus services, to trains. They should be disproportionately contributing more to the emissions reductions. The people further out, they have got increasing opportunities, but are still yet limited. So let's start with the people who have been the beneficiaries of considerable investment as of the moment. Councillor Bartley quite rightly referred to behaviour change. I don't necessarily think we can hold that all down to Auckland Transport. We've got a part to play in that, because I see from my relatively uninformed standpoint a lot of things that could be happening right now in terms of use of existing infrastructure that goes to walking. We have footpaths in most parts of Auckland. We have the potential for utilising road space. It's happened on Whangapara Road very successfully for minimal output. We have a whole lot of things we could be doing right now, and in fact, it's the behaviour change that is required, that is not something that Auckland Transport can do off its own bat. It's got to need leadership from the government and also leadership from us. So, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the ability just to make a few comments, but thank you, I guess, in particular to the people who have worked on this for the last 15 months. I think it's a reasonably encouraging blueprint for our future, but as you've said, there is more to be done, and obviously in the very near future, the flexibility that we need to address this major problem in terms of climate change will need to be taken on a far more visible form from all parties, not just us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I'll now go to Councillor Coombe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to support the motion with some reservations, so I just would like to talk to that. But in terms of coming to this draft plan, I do think of this little fella on the front cover and whether what's actually in the plan is living up to his aspirations and what we need to be putting in place for Aucklanders now and future generations. I also just think of that in terms of my role, and I always think of my role and why I'm here is because I want to make Auckland a connected, healthy, sustainable, vibrant and inclusive place. And then looking at this plan, I think about the feedback that we got from our local boards, and I know there might be concerns about how the feedback was perhaps cut and diced or how you review it. But when you look at what our local boards told us, who are, they're really in touch with their communities and have really thought about their local board plans. Our local boards were incredibly in unison when they presented to us. They all covered the same themes. They might have highlighted some different projects, but they all wanted transport choice. They all wanted mode shift. They all wanted action on climate. They all wanted to be able to implement local solutions. They all had concerns around safety, equity. They all wanted a response to growth in housing. And I think that was a really holistic overview of Auckland and what they wanted to deliver. And thinking about the holistic well-being and livability of our city. So I think it's really important that this plan delivers on those aspirations. The reason why I have a lot of reservations is because there is such an incredible amount to work to do to align this plan with our own goals that we have set through Te Taruki a Tawhiri. Because when I think about the equity issues, and I thank you, Councillor Dalton, for talking to that report, which is central to our submission to the government, and it's great that we've incorporated that. When I think about the travel times of people doing 2-hour commutes around the city, the safety issues on our rural roads, the productivity concerns that we have, the impact on small businesses, transport, poverty, and all the external impacts on our communities of the current transport system, including pollution as well. All of that is the overlay of that is if we look to address our carbon emissions, we will be acting on all of those issues. And I think we really need to get aligned with what we have already agreed for our emissions reduction targets and our goals around mode shift and reducing vehicle transport kilometres. Because if we achieve that, we can achieve all these other benefits for our communities and particularly productivity. So we know that reducing vehicles on the road, providing alternatives, will free up our roads for those who need to be there, in particular freight. And I don't think this plan this RLTP is on the way there, but it's not fully aligned with where we need to be. And I'm glad the Mayor, thank you, Mayor, for doing the rundown of what is actually in the plan, because you can lose sight of that because there's a huge amount in there. And I guess this is why I want to support it, because I want to be part of that solution, because a lot of this is how we implement it, how we consider every roading project as an opportunity to meet the needs of our communities. And that's the same in terms of all the issues that we need to address, whether it's the trucks on the roads in Drury. We still got to address that issue, and we've just got to be part of the solution of how we do it, because we've just got to find a different way of doing that that isn't a $3.5 billion road. And I think also the plan itself on page 6 of the plan in the context, it actually says, Aucklanders tell us they are supportive of tackling climate change, yet the way to successfully execute the transition is both complex and unclear. It must be tackled using a systems and evidence-based approach and result in equitable outcomes. And I absolutely sign up for that with a regional approach. I also just take on board what Councillor Bartley brings to the conversation around how we've got to socialise that change and bring people along, because there's huge opportunities there for making our communities safer, being able to get kids to walk to school. There are 40,000 kids who every day are driven under 5Ks by a parent who goes home again. 20% of the trips on the road are discretionary. 60% of trips on the road are under 5Ks. So we know that it's using the network that we've got more efficiently rather than just throwing more money at it. So I just wanted to make a final comment in terms of a huge amount hangs on E. This is why I'm happy to endorse the plan with the addition of E. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for working on that, because that is where we've really got to do a whole lot of mahi around how we're going to reprioritise and refocus and get all our goals aligned and what we need to achieve around mode shift and reducing vehicle kilometres travelled. So I will support for that reason, and I'm also heartened too by what we've put into the submission that we're making on the government's pathway. You know, we've all signed up to this. It's very ambitious, but I think it's good that we've got broad political support around the table to get on that pathway. And so I know there's going to be a lot more work ahead. But so for those reasons, I do commend this to members. And I'm happy to support the resolutions with those reservations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Coombe, and Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Chair. I guess I'm kind of gutted, really. I just feel kind of exhausted by the whole conversation, because we keep signing up for things and then I guess we just don't get what it looks like going forward. I'm a bit... We keep arguing about like what people want and what people don't want. What I want is everyone to have all the options that, say, I have. You know, we seem to be like, oh, you can catch the bus, so you shouldn't talk about my community. I want every community to have the option that I have outside my driveway in the mornings, a bus every 10 minutes straight to my workplace, and I have choice, and it's easy and it's safe. You know, everyone said the Northern Busway would be a failure. It was pretty common knowledge it was going to fail when it was proposed, and it was predicting in 2013 to only have 1.2 million users for the year. In 2013, it had almost 3 million users for the year. In the 2019, just before COVID, it had 8 million users per year. And that wasn't because that community was desperately asking for buses or wanted to drive or could. It's because the infrastructure was provided and it slowly got progressively better. The places where we've put cycleways in, we've gone from 800,000 users on those cycleways and those areas a year in 2013 to almost 4 million cycle trips on those areas now. They didn't magically come from nowhere. They came because they were put in place. We have 7,000 kilometres of roads across the city, and it's like under 100 kilometres of that have safe cycleways. People are still cycling on those roads, but it's just super, super unsafe. And we only, by this plan, increase safe cycling opportunities for our communities by about 200 kilometres over the next 10 years. It's still a very small slice of what we can do. So I'm not saying, I'll just give a quote from, we can't just build our way out of this problem in the long run. It's not possible to keep adding lanes to the motorways. It becomes more and more expensive and for less and less gain. Now that quote was from Simon Bridges as Transport Minister when he launched ATAP in 2016-17. He recognised at that time that it was impossible to help change the city without really shifting mode shift. And so I guess when I look at what we've had announced on Eastern Busway, we know that Howard Botany Eastern area is desperate for choice. And now we've just pushed that choice out a little further. We know that Councillor Cooper and Councillor Henderson are desperate for a busway because it gives choice. I'm pretty sure a bunch of people out west would take the bus if they could, but it is absolutely painful for most of those people to sit in a bus on the motorway in the same traffic as all the vehicles. So there is work to be done, and there's lots being done. Puhunui Station and others is going to make huge difference to those communities, but I just want more, and I want to know how we get more. And I think we're also setting up Auckland Transport to fail because we're setting them expectations to do the same thing with the same money. And the government is going to be directing us within a year after the Climate Commission directs them to change things dramatically. Because I'm worried that all our communities, when petrol prices hit record amounts in 5 to 10 years' time, because the whole world is changing. The UK is banning petrol and diesel cars from 2030. The EU is going to be doing the same. We will not have opportunities to purchase cars from any market probably in that time. And it's not going to be everyone switching to EVs because we know it's expensive and we know EVs still create congestion. So I guess I don't know if I want to support this because I feel like we're still setting up a 10-year plan for our communities to fail and the world is going to change ahead of us once again. So I don't exactly know what the answers are, but I just feel like we don't have the options or tools when we've been asking for them. It's not just about reducing emissions, it's about giving people options, the same options I have every morning outside my front door. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker, please.
I'll be supporting this. Councillor Newman reminds me of the many meetings that I engaged with on the Northern Busway Committee and the constant questions I raised about the inadequacy of what was being provided at that point, the battles that I had with Rodney District Council to get them to buy the land for the busway station up at Silverdale, which was a mammoth effort in itself, I can tell you, against a background where most of them didn't really know much about buses. Thought it was totally irrelevant. But I've got real concerns yet again that obviously we're voting on something and we're investigating all of these things. If we benchmark ourselves against other cities around the planet, we're just woeful in respect of how far behind we are, and increasingly we need to do that. I have certainly concerns around what sort of value for money we're getting out of our investment in Auckland Transport across a number of things. Increasingly, we need to be a regulator and asking many more questions around that. I have no idea. All I know is a list of projects with some costs, and other cities I know deliver more economically and far quicker than us. And along with Councillor Watson, I'm really emphatic that we need to be driving behavioural change as a council. That is what other cities are doing much more aggressively than we are. against the background where there are probably more people buying bigger cars and SUVs and driving them around, and obviously that's hitting the news all the time. So look, I'm going to go along with this, but I've got ongoing reservations around how we're tracking, frankly.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Mulholland, please.
Thanks, Chair. Nice to have a say on behalf of the people I represent and as a regional councillor. First of all, I'd like to thank the team, and whilst it's often said that, again, a councillor who has not been here in a term before shouldn't raise it, I am well and truly going to raise the matter of how many times we have met to discuss this issue and to debate it from my perspective. So if we ain't made it today, then I'm concerned about what we're really doing. So thank you that we are coming to this point of conclusion, because I feel everyone has had an opportunity to input. So I really want to acknowledge Auckland Transport and the staff at Council and Chair, you, for doing that, giving everyone an opportunity for the lengthy debate. And I also would like to acknowledge the Deputy Mayor for having the discussions he's had to have with regards to supporting some of the projects. With regards to Councillor Newman's statement on Mill Road, I'm going to add my name to that just as a note. You know, one might say I come from a small area and I am one councillor for one ward. I just want to note that I don't see a lot for my ward in this plan, and I haven't complained bitterly, because we're a collective and we collaborate and we work together. So I just want to note that for other councillors that are listening to me, and I'm guessing some of you probably won't be because it is near the end of the day. I do want to acknowledge government has supported and funded a lot of these projects, but I also want to say we really should not be, and I've just heard it from Councillor Walker, which is fine, it's a view and opinion. Maybe we do need to change behaviour, but I just want to say I'm not a dictator, so I don't want to dictate to people how to live. I want to work together, and it's not that's not a criticism, that's just a note on if we're going to drive behaviour, it's about working together, not dictating to people whether they've got a SUV, a UV or whatever, because I actually am not one who is a huge supporter of the changes that government is putting into place with regards to the climate change, so I'll be buying a SUV soon on that basis. Just with regards to a couple of other things, I am grateful that we have a transit-oriented development project in Newland, but I just want to note this. It ain't perfect, okay? We still have people trying to get a bus to Newland. We have got people parking everywhere, Chair. We have also got issues there. But I want to acknowledge how grateful I am that for many years, when I worked at the old Waitakere City Council, and maybe I am showing my age, but you know, we worked tirelessly with many agencies, government and many local people to get that fabulous project, and I'm grateful for that. But it is not perfect and it is not working as well as what it could be. But it is working to some degree because people are using the public transport, because it's a great facility. They are using the buses, they are using the trains, so that's just outstanding. And just to end, because I had contemplated whether I would speak or not today on this matter, I was out walking a couple of nights ago at 8:30 in the evening around the streets of my area, doing a little delivery. I felt quite safe. It was actually very interesting, and one of the things I thought as I walked down Blockhouse Bay Road, I thought to myself, I am so lucky this is a great footpath. Now, wait a minute, all my residents may not, or the residents may not agree with that, but I will say it was a great footpath. It felt safe, it was well constructed, and I am acknowledging that additional funding is going into things like footpaths, but I do want to say it felt good, because I think, again, in debate against what some others have said, I actually think we're living in a fabulous city that has got great infrastructure, considering government gets quite a lot of our funding. And I think, you know, when I was reading the LTP last night, they get quite a bit of funding and you look at the GDP and what they're taking from us, I think we're doing incredibly well. We can always do better, there is no doubt, but I want to acknowledge those good things. I do want to say that I do also acknowledge the representation chair through Auckland Transport when I need to put into things like this or to share information. It is taken on board, and because I'm new, I go a different way about it. I talk with people directly. So I want to acknowledge the staff that have assisted me at Auckland Transport. But I do think as a city, I believe we're doing well. Sure, we can do better, but let's face it, we are a huge city that has had years of underinvestment, and that is not the fault of everyone sitting at this table. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Mulholland. That draws us to the end of the debate, so we'll close the debate and we'll go to the vote. And I think the motions are clear. They're before us, and we'll take it on the voices. All those in favour, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And to the contrary, please say no. To the contrary, say no.
No.
Okay, there is a one, and I hear the voice of Councillors Young, and I think it was Councillor Fletcher, was it, or Councillor Stewart?
Stewart.
Okay, thank you. So we'll record those two votes of dissension on the motions. And members, we have no extraordinary business, and that draws us to the conclusion of this extraordinary meeting of the Planning Committee. Thank you to you all.